Hello and welcome to this week's overview of our writers. I'm not going to be providing any background information about these three men because I have given you links to three wonderful documentaries about their lives. To the left is William Faulkner. In the middle is Ernest Hemingway, looking very outdoorsy as he often does in his photographs. And then to the right is F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he's looking dapper, probably wearing a Brooks Brothers tweed. In this screen, I wanted to give you a sense of their dates. You'll see that Fitzgerald died quite young. Faulkner and Hemingway have almost exactly the same dates, very similar. World War I is an event that shaped their lives and very much affected all three men. All three men wanted to serve in the war. Hemingway was the only one that got overseas, and he served in the ambulance corps and suffered a severe injury. Faulkner wanted to join the army but was too short, so he went up to Canada and enlisted in the Canadian Air Force, but the war ended before he could be sent anywhere. And the same thing with Fitzgerald. Although he was in the army, he was never deployed because the war ended. In terms of their status as writers, all three are considered just iconic figures in American literature, and all three are known for their novels, though their short stories are certainly important also. Fitzgerald has come down to us as someone of a kind of a mythic quality, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. In terms of his writing, he's a prose writer who is often, at his best, poetic with wonderful metaphors and images. Faulkner was very much broke with tradition. He did a stream of consciousness often in his novels. Used multiple narrative perspectives when he was writing, and in fact, they could make his novels somewhat difficult to follow. Ernest Hemingway, of course, is celebrated for his clarity, his straightforward style that one might even consider being a modest style, really unadorned. I love some of his quotes about his own writing. He said that a writer's style should be, quote, direct and personal. Imagery should be, quote, rich and earthy. And really, the best writers are those who are vigorous. So he kind of has come down to us as someone with a quote unquote manly style. All right, F. Scott Fitzgerald, let's start with This Side of Paradise, which was at the time considered in 1920 almost like a shocking novel. It really laid bare the young men and women of the jazz age, women that cut their hair short and wore short skirts, the flappers. And he based much of this novel on his days at Princeton. His next novel continued in that vein, The Beautiful and the Damned, about a couple living in the kind of jazzy society in New York City, drinking hard, partying hard, um, wealthy, not having to hold a job, the kind of idle rich. And it really cemented his reputation himself as this kind of celebrity figure. He and his wife, Zelda, who was also famous, they would ride cabs on the top of cabs, on the roofs of cabs in New York. They danced in fountains. They went to lavish parties. They drank hard. Eventually, even these two settled in Paris to kind of try to sober up. Though by this time they were creating this myth of this celebrity couple. And while he was in Paris, he hung out with Hemingway and these other great writers. And Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby, which is really a quintessential American novel about Jay Gatsby, a man who invents himself. Comes from a very humble background and becomes a rich, famous person. And the story is told in the voice of Nick Carraway, a kind of an outsider who is visiting Long Island and gives us this tragic story of Jay Gatsby. 1934, a much later work, Tender as the Night, based, very much on Fitzgerald's relationship with his wife Zelda. Zelda was a really beautiful woman who was fun to be with. She was an artist in her own right. But later in life, she had a breakdown, and it most people, scholars, say that she was schizophrenic. She was institutionalized, and Tender in the Night is the story of an American psychologist and his wife is one of his former patients, and it's about the trials they go through with her mental illness. So these are just four of his many novels. And I would say if you get a chance to read any of them this summer, that would be good. But we're going to be looking at his short stories, of course. One of them is an early one from 1920, Bernice Bobs Her Hair, and I've put up a little video link. You can look at the video version of this short story. It's about a young woman who decides to cut her hair off just so she can be popular, and you'll see what happens with that. 1931, Babylon Revisited, which has a wonderful title, is about a recovering alcoholic, and he's returning to Europe. His young daughter lives there, and he would like to regain custody of her. Is it kind of about returning to a kind of a place where he had once enjoyed living in the 1920s. And then 1937, a much later work, um, an alcoholic case, and that's what we have in our book and what I have assigned for you to read. Fitzgerald himself was an alcoholic, really had some awful times in his life struggling with alcohol, and this is a very unadorned, unsentimental version, a vision really, of what it means to be an alcoholic and what it's like to deal with an alcoholic. All right, our next writer, William Faulkner. He is definitely someone who can be hard to grapple with when you're reading his novels. One of his most famous novels appeared in 1929, The Sound and the Fury, and it's set in northern Mississippi. Many of his novels are. It is about the Compson family, and the family, wrote quite a bit about this imaginary family. We see one of the characters, Quentin, in That Evening Sun, the short story that we're reading, but he helps to narrate this novel along with his brothers, Benji and Jason. And it's a very kind of complex novel, difficult to follow. And some of the themes are quite gothic in terms of the violence. There's incest, there's things that are dark, but it's sometimes also kind of humorous. And in that vein, As I Lay Dying is certainly a novel that is a Southern Gothic. It's darkly humorous. It is about the death of now the main character, Addie Bundren, and then how her journey then to the cemetery. Very kind of innovative narrative techniques that Faulkner uses. He has narration by, in this novel, 15 different voices. So you can imagine at times it becomes difficult to follow the actual narrative. Light in August is looks again at three different threads, three different stories of three different characters, and he manages to weave them together. Now, Absalom, though any of these could be considered a masterpiece, I think perhaps this, I would categorize this as his masterpiece. It is the tale of Thomas Sutpen, who is someone who has worked his way, who has become wealthy. He was a poor person and becomes wealthy and marries into a respectable family. But it's a tragedy. His own ambition and his extreme need to control his family brings about, not just his ruin, but the ruin of his entire family. So Faulkner definitely is not a light or easy read, but he is well worth delving into. Now, the two short stories that we're looking at are, in contrast to these novels, very easy to follow, and the narrative voice is a single narrative voice, and We don't have any trouble with that. We get a portrait of the South, though, in both of these. And that evening sun is absolutely fascinating, especially when you think about the themes of race and class. And A Rose for Emily, I would imagine many of you have read that already, certainly has a surprising ending to it. And it does have a little sense of, definitely a sense of dark humor. Okay, Ernest Hemingway, again, someone I'm sure that whom you've read. I'm sure you've read at least one of his novels. 1926, The Sun Also Rises, is um, it's about Americans living abroad, Americans living in Europe in the 1920s. The principal character is Jake. Jake is a journalist, and the leading female character is really an iconic American literary character, Lady Brett Ashley, who is the widow of a British officer who was killed in World War One. Farewell to Arms. I remember reading this in high school and just absolutely loving it. It's a sad story of a American officer and a British Army nurse, and Hemingway called it his Romeo and Juliet with its tragedy. For Whom the Bell Tolls is an interesting look, fictionalized account of a man in the Spanish Civil War, and The Old Man and the Sea, uh, published much later in 1952, and this book is widely read in high school, I think, because it's short. It's about Santiago, an old Cuban fisherman who's having a battle with a huge fish, this enormous marlin, and he is somebody that critics say, here's a critic, Philip Young, if I can find this quote here. Yeah, here it is. It says that he is a, quote, simple man capable of decency, dignity, and heroism. And you know, the battle with the fish is seen as heroic. And Young points out that this character, this hero of The Old Man in the Sea, is very much a Hemingway hero, a man who has, quote, unquote, grace under pressure, which is what Hemingway so admired. Is A Soldier's War. All of us will be reading, because this is our textbook, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, and nothing happens in this story, so I'll be interested to see what you write about it. It's dialogue. And same thing with Hills Like White Elephants is basically a dialogue. And you've probably, I would imagine, most of the class has read that short story because it's so widely discussed and anthologized. So, anyway, this week I look forward to reading what you have to say about these three literary legends.